One of the questions that I get asked the most as the downtown growth and development reporter is why downtown Knoxville does not have a more defined skyline. Or a more prominent skyline, I guess. You could argue that it is defined. We have the odd pyramid-looking Hotel Knoxville building. We have the Sun Sphere. We do have two, I guess you could argue three, with the Andrew Johnson building, high-rises along the southern end of Gay Street. But other than that, if you look at other cities, like Nashville to the west, although that's obviously a totally different animal, Knoxville's skyline is a little bit in the shadows of some of our counterparts. But that could be changing with the plan for a 16-story high-rise along the Tennessee River on the downtown side, not on the South Knoxville side where a lot of the attention has been lately. But that proposed development has been met with some pushback from community leaders, from people who just live around the project site in downtown Knoxville, who are concerned that this, one, might not be of best public use to people who live in Knoxville, two, that a building of that magnitude might not be the best look in terms of how you would welcome somebody to the city from South Knoxville, and three, how a development of this magnitude could impact what traffic and pedestrian foot traffic and just generally how people get around downtown Knoxville and experience downtown Knoxville in that area. Joining me on the podcast today, it's been a long time, but Silas Sloan, welcome back to the show. Silas, you want to tell everybody a little bit about yourself?
It is great to be back, Ryan. I am the growth and development reporter here, so I cover all of the, as it says, growth and development in East Tennessee. So that's been real estate and Advanced Knox. You may have seen that in the headlines. That's been kind of my baby for the past 2 years, and new industries coming here to East Tennessee.
Yeah, and now you were actually at, well, let's step back a second. I'm Ryan Wilusz. I introduced my title, not my name. Ryan Wilusz, Downtown Growth and Development Reporter at KnoxNews. And before I was on this project, I know you were at a design review board meeting, I mean, it was maybe a year ago. It's been a while when this project first popped up, and it was described, I think, by someone on the board as a mullet of a project. What was your first experience with this project when you first heard about it?
Well, when I first saw it, my first reaction was, whoa, this is big. It looked so much bigger than everything on that rendering when they showed it. And it also looked so much different than anything else in the Knoxville skyline.
Right, yeah, so hence the mullet. I mean, you have the white concrete on the back side of the building, which actually faces the river. When I was looking to write my last story, I was trying to think, what is the unique part about this project? Yes, it's big. A lot of projects are big. Yes, it's adding housing, which can be a touchy subject depending on how you do it. But the real thing that I felt like I was curious about and was intrigued by coming out of that design review board meeting, which, by the way, there was enough kind of pushback and arguments against the project, which we'll get into here in a little bit, that vote was pushed back. So potentially developers could be coming back in May to try to get this ball rolling on this project. But the interesting thing is that the back side of the building, in a way, is kind of like the front side of the building. It's what I feel like most people would see. A lot of people are not going to be on the West Hill Avenue side of this project, and so it's probably a good idea for us to describe exactly where this is. The Henley Street Bridge, immediately to the east, down below on Neyland Drive. Technically, it's Front Avenue, but that's practically Neyland Drive. So it's right there along the river, again, on the downtown side. And so a lot of people, I think, will be experiencing this building coming in from South Knoxville. It'll be the first thing you see whenever you cross the Henley Street Bridge. It'll also be the first thing people see who live in the overlook condo whenever they look out their window, because it's popping up right in front of that. So there's another marker for you, which is also part of the reason there's been so much concern about it. A lot of the neighbors in the area talked about why they didn't think this was a good project. Obviously, it didn't get said exactly explicitly in the meeting, but of course people are concerned about how this would impact their view. But most people experiencing this building coming in from South Knoxville, the first thing you would see is a large white concrete building, 16 stories high, and that's kind of part of what has this project being talked about so much, is that it's not just a building popping up. It is what would be a defining building, again, of the Knoxville skyline. And it's one of those things, man. You hear a lot of people talk about, we want this, and then something comes, and then they're like, oh, but not quite exactly like this. And so one of the big concerns, and what I want to talk about next, is just this area of town, because talking with the design review board, the developers went back and forth with board members about pedestrian activity. And downtown Knoxville, I don't want to get into much into the weeds about codes and whatnot. But downtown Knoxville has a variety of different districts with different code regulations and zoning regulations. But generally speaking, downtown Knoxville developments, especially when they involve residential, are typically encouraged to go ground level, something that promotes pedestrian activity, whether that be a cafe or a coffee shop or a restaurant or whatever, on the ground level, apartments above. Mixed use, pretty basic stuff. On the West Hill Avenue side of this project, there's a cafe planned, but on the South Knoxville side of the project, it's just 4 levels of garage. And I think that's what a lot of people are hung up on is 4 levels of garage the best way to promote pedestrian activity? Now, on the flip side, Silas, I have a question for you. How long have you lived in Knoxville now?
Just over 2. I think I'm coming up on 2.5 years.
2.5 years. How many times have you walked down there?
Not once.
Not once. And so this is where the conversation gets interesting, because you can look around downtown Knoxville and you can see examples of buildings where there's garages on the first level. And Bill Lyons, who owns a condo in the Overlook building, also was had high-level policy roles under every Knoxville mayor since Victor Ashe. He's a public policy expert. He was talking about, you could see examples of other places where there are garages on ground level. Precedent is not what should be looked at primarily, Bill was saying at this design review board meeting, because precedents, sometimes there's bad precedents. And that's kind of where codes come into play is, they're designed to promote pedestrian activity on the ground floors in downtown Knoxville. But as you mentioned, there's no real pedestrian activity over there. So now we're getting into a conversation of, is it a private developer's job to promote and encourage pedestrian activity where there historically has been none? Just thinking about that area of downtown, what do you think, Silas? Well, let's start first. A building of this magnitude with 4 levels of garage, what does that do for that part of town? If you're thinking about the riverside, my gut is not much.
I have the similar gut feeling. I think when you're driving on Neyland Drive, it's not going to make much of a difference. I think a building of this magnitude, you're going to see it from far away. You're going to see the apartments on top. I think when you're up right next to it, I don't think it's going to make much of a difference.
Right. And so, with this high rise, potentially nothing would change about Neyland Drive. It would still be, no pedestrian activity as there is right now. There's 4 levels of garage. But the design review board is encouraging the developers to go back and think about ways that potentially you can activate that backside. And there's been a lot of focus and conversations on the Tennessee River and development around the Tennessee River, specifically on the South Knoxville side. You've heard on the podcast here before about the pedestrian bridge. But a few years back, I wrote a story about why there hasn't been more development on the downtown side. And there's a lot of barriers. It's difficult to build along a river. There's a lot of environmental things that you don't expect. Neyland Drive is 4 lanes wide, so that takes up a lot of area along the Tennessee River. And so there are these barriers. Maybe it's worth just brainstorming. I mean, not to do the developer's job for them, because ultimately at the end of the day, it'll be up to them to decide how they can best move forward with a solution that pleases the design review board, pleases, their end to be able to actually pull off the project in a viable way. Thinking about, though, a big apartment building like that, what kind of amenities would activate that area? One thing that came up was maybe some sort of public plaza on the backside, at least some more landscaping so you don't see a giant concrete garage on the backside. On the West Hill Avenue side, on the front side, there is a cafe, but really we're talking about the backside here. I can't really think of much. That is such a tight property.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. I mean, a plaza would be great. It could maybe boost the aesthetics of that backside, but I mean, it's just not very connected to a walkable area as it is. So, I'm kind of I don't know, but I'm not a developer either, so I can't say for sure.
Yeah, landscaping makes sense. I think I think what you say about the plaza, yes, it can activate it. And who knows? I mean, that's part of the conversation, too, that you hear a lot is sometimes it takes one. It takes one person to just develop and to have a little bit of activity to encourage other activity around it. So potentially, I mean, if there was something that was added onto the backside of this building that made it a little bit more lively, cars are driving by, seeing people playing, it just all adds into this formula that creates this atmosphere of what a riverfront could be like.
Well, and you talked about the property being really tight. It's also very sloped and very uneven. So, I think that also poses a real challenge of how do you make this super steep and significantly lower portion of the property mix in, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I know the developers are in a tight spot because when it comes to these projects, and I think a lot of times people talk about like, oh, we're talking about millions and millions of dollars here, and people are asking for help, and they're just wanting to do this development for themselves, and they're not thinking about the big picture. You mentioned the sloping topography. I mentioned, some of the environmental challenges. We're talking about, a project that's already been scaled down. Back in 2018, you might have remembered the T at the riverfront, which was going to be 19 stories. And so that project had to be scaled back a little bit. It's a complicated thing. So I feel for the developers who are trying to figure out a way to make this work and make everybody happy. But also this conversation is worth having right now because, again, a lot of the conversation is going on the south side of the river. The south side of the river and the north side of the river are connected by the river. They're not far apart. Peyton Manning might be able to throw football. Do you think Peyton Manning could throw? He could throw football across the river, right?
I think he still could.
You think he still
could? For sure. Yeah.
So they're very close. And when you think about the University of Tennessee, the Neyland Entertainment District is being planned, how close that project is to the university. It's on that western side of downtown. Even though right now it may not seem like there's much happening in that area, in a few years there very well could be. And it's up to the developers, Woodfield Development Group out of South Carolina, to decide where they fit in this changing scene, whether they want to be developers who set the precedent for promoting that area as a pedestrian-friendly area, or if they just want to continue with their plans as is. Of course, that would require the approval of the Design Review Board. But Silas, you've been to a lot of, maybe not Design Review Board meetings, but Design Review Board is part of Knoxville, Knox County planning meetings. And those can be long and lengthy. There's a lot of discussion, a lot of boring discussion, it seems like sometimes. But is this something that you feel is typical in terms of, hey, a developer comes in and has what they think is a great idea, and the planning commissioner is pushing back and saying, how does this benefit the public more? How much is that public benefit talked about typically in planning?
It definitely comes up. I think it depends on the development. If it's downtown in an area where there's a lot of people, that's going to be at the top of mind. And there's a lot of talk of buffers and landscaping to help kind of ease the transition and make things at least look nicer and be away from things. So amenities to the public, it definitely comes up quite a bit.
And I feel like it comes up a lot, too, when you're thinking about, if you're a developer, getting some kind of financial assistance, whether that's in the terms of pilots or TIFs. I had heard that the developers were looking for a pilot on this. I need to get the details on that exactly. Essentially a tax break that helps encourage the development, with the idea being that it'll be paid back in the long run because you get a new development in your city, in this case in your downtown. But yeah, as many public benefits as you can have are going to help. It's interesting, again, too, we talked about the cafe on the front side. That's a public benefit. It also came up during Design Review Board meeting that, hey, who's going to use that cafe? Because that's not really could you see yourself going over there for a snack or coffee on that side of town?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I typically go to that area. I park in the garage right across adjacent from there to go to the city county building, and it just doesn't feel like a vibrant place. It kind of feels like the edge of town. Nobody's really there, so it doesn't feel like an ideal place for a cafe in my experience. But then again, I just use that area for parking. Somebody else could view that very differently. Yeah,
and the cafe, as it was described to me, would be run by the developer through a third party. That essentially, think of it like a hotel with a coffee bar. You walk in, you grab a coffee, get your order, then you kind of continue through that ground floor to access the rest of the building. That's how it would be. So maybe it'd be of great benefit to people who live there. But again, going back to sympathizing with the developers who are trying to build something that will change really how people view Knoxville, quite literally, in terms of the skyline. Sympathizing with that, but also looking at other examples where the first person who really makes an effort in an area, and not that these developers would be the first. We mentioned the Overlook earlier. We mentioned that there's some stuff happening really close by on campus, but that area of town really has not been developed into a lively part of town. There's stuff happening over there, but nothing really public facing. You look at other places like South Knoxville, Sevier Avenue. It took one brewery and a pizza shop, and then some other things popped up. It takes one person to go into that unproven market and prove that there's potential. My worry is if you build something without a public facing component to it, it doesn't really signal that there's potential for this area to be more lively.
Well, I have a question for you. If, this apartment is going to be 290 units?
Yeah.
Maybe that cafe will be more. Do you think that cafe could be more accessible if there are 300 plus people living right above it? Like, do you think that could impact the liveliness of that area just by that injection of population?
Of course. I mean, 290 people, I think, it'll depend. It'll also depend on if this is like a real cafe or if this is like really like ends up being more of an amenity specifically to the residents. But 300 people living in there, people who live in there, they might have a few friends that live in the building, but they have friends all over town, right? If I have a cool cafe in my apartment building, maybe I invite friends over. Maybe, it's not just those 290 people that are going to be experiencing it. It's just like a house. You have people over to your house. You have people over to grill out, whatever it is. People, I think, will start using that area of town more. You'll see more activity. I think that's one of the concerns, too, is how does this affect traffic? One of the concerns that was brought up is just sort of the ingress and egress of a garage that's planned there on site. And not only is that a very steep, sloping piece of land to build on, but if you've ever driven down that way, which is like one of the best ways to get to the river from downtown Knoxville, you really have to put on your brakes. You're going almost straight down and around a corner. So traffic will be interesting with this, but yeah, I think again, it takes one, it happens slowly, it happens over time. And I think the important thing for everybody to think about is not just looking at this as and Bill Lyons said it best, this is a 100-year decision. This is not just a single building. This is, a 16-story building, which we haven't seen in a long time, popping up in a very prominent part of town. And so I think it has potential to get more than 290 people down there. It has potential to get those 290 people and their friends. And if everybody's going down there and experiencing it, you want it to be a good first impression. And I think the developers want that too. I don't think, there's been a lot of criticism about, they're out of town and are they really thinking about Knoxville with this? If you're a developer at that point in your career where you're working on these big projects everywhere, you've learned over time that you got to try to accommodate people. So I don't think that there is this, maybe perhaps as suggested, although it was kind of iffy, them not sharing the renderings with us, which is a whole other story that came up at planning. But I don't think that they're just totally going to disregard the public. They're thinking about that. It's just how logistically and can you pull something of this magnitude off and make everybody happy, which nothing's ever going to make everybody happy.
Nothing's going to make everybody happy, but I'm also curious. Nothing is guaranteed. Another question I'm curious about is, could having this big apartment with some retail on the ground floor be kind of a little stadium project for that area of town? If there's a big development there and there's some movement, could more developments more amenities pop up on that side of downtown?
I just don't know where they would go. We had a whole podcast dedicated to what we coined as West Downtown Knoxville. And, that being the part of town that's kind of bordered by Henley Street. And, we talked about how Henley Street's kind of a barrier in between downtown and the campus. But it's already, I don't know about the river, because this is a project that's been talked about since 2018 that's taken this long to finally get built. And there are so many challenges in that area. And so possibly it could, but I think it needs to be proven, first of all. And I think the way you prove it is with, finding a way to build up that area with more activity. One thing that came up during the design review board meeting, which I think is worth noting, a lot of the conversation was surrounded by just the magnitude of the building and how it blocks sight lines to the Henley Street Bridge, and whether it just does more covering up of things than complementing things. And the point that was brought up is really anything of significant value that's built here, especially with the slope of the building and everything else, is probably going to have that impact. I mean, unless it's just like a little tiny shop on Nealand. I mean, nothing would ever come up. I mean, the most obvious thing for that site is some sort of mixed use. Obviously, you cover a lot of housing. There's a need for housing in Knoxville. What's the latest on housing right now, or apartments?
Really, housing is still largely unaffordable and very expensive. So adding 290 units would make a significant dent in the housing crunch here. Yeah,
and the thing that's interesting is another conversation that comes up is how much are these things going to cost? That conversation has come up a lot down on Cumberland Avenue with these student housing apartments that are popping up, and people saying, who's going to be able to afford to live there? It's a delicate game you have to play because who can afford to live there? There's somebody out there that will pay the price because that's why they're building them. People, they do a lot of market analysis. They know what the rates are. They know what people will commit to. So people are frustrated about that. But on the flip side, if you move people in there, we all know this. UT has a housing problem. If people do move into those and are willing to pay that premium price, that opens up housing elsewhere. And so, there needs to be a mix.
And it's really a supply and demand issue. When you have more supply, there's not enough supply and so much demand. So things are going to be expensive. But the more you add, ideally, prices will go down a little bit or stabilize. So adding inventory is inherently a good thing.
Right. So we'll be following this. I mean, it's we talked through this whole project and we didn't even say the name of it. It is Hill and Locust because it's on Hill and Locust.
It's so creative.
It's Hill Avenue to the north. Again, the Neyland Drive / Front Avenue. Is it Front? What is it? Front Avenue?
I believe it's Front Avenue.
Front Avenue.
Southwest Front Avenue, if you really want to get specific.
To the south, Henley Street Bridge to the west, Locust Street to the east. So, yeah, it's called Hill and Locust. Maybe I didn't bring it up because it's not that exciting. Who knows? Names change, too. But we'll be following it. If they are at the Design Review Board meeting again in May, I know I will be there. I'll be following along this project, and you can follow along as well over at KnoxNews.com. As always, the scruffy stuff is brought to you by Knox News, so head on over to subscribe.KnoxNews.com to check out our latest offers and support local journalism today. A subscription gets you an all-access pass to all of our premium exclusive content, everything we talk about here on the show, and a whole lot more. If you'd like to keep up with me in between episodes, you can give me a follow on Instagram at KnoxScruff, or shoot me an email at ryan.wilsz@knoxnews.com. Silas, for you, what's the best way to keep up with what you got going on?
Yeah, you can follow me on X, formerly known as Twitter, at Silas Sloan, SILASLOAN. Combine the middle two S's. Mm-hmm. Felt very slick. You can also shoot me an email at Silas, SILAS.Sloan, SLOAN, at KnoxNews.com. And those are really the two best ways to reach me.
And the best way to keep up with the podcast is to go ahead and hit that like or subscribe button on whatever platform you're listening on. That way you get a notification every time a new episode drops, or just come back here on Tuesdays. If you enjoyed the show, leave us a review. Tell us what you like. Tell us what you'd like to hear us talk about next. Make it a 5-star one if you would. And to get even more involved in the downtown discussion, there's a lot more than just the podcast and all the content you can find at Knox News. There is the Urban Knoxville newsletter, which you can get sent directly to your email inbox for free every Friday, as well as the Urban Knoxville Facebook group. I'm going to link both of those in the podcast description, as well as links to the stories related to this project that we talked about today. So be sure to check that out and holler at me. Between now and Tuesday, we have an exciting episode next week. I want to tease it, but I'm not. I'm going to keep it a secret, but you're not going to want to miss it. So thanks for listening, and we will talk to you again soon. And until next time, stay scruffy, Knoxville.